We would like to send out a special thanks to HelloFresh.com for supporting The Trail Went Cold. And we would like to thank you, the listeners, by giving you the chance to receive $30 off your first week of deliveries when you go to HelloFresh.com and use the offer code COLD30. That's COLD30. Enjoy the show. May 22nd, 1982. Hamersville, Ohio. 46-year-old appliance repairman Perman Gilbert leaves his family's home to make some service calls. He never returns, and his nude body is found in a ditch the following day. Numerous theories surround Perman's murder, including rumors that his death might have been connected to drug trafficking, his brother's association with organized crime, or a secret affair gone wrong. However, the identity of Perman's killer and the motive for his murder remain unknown. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest Minisode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today I will be covering another unsolved mysteries case, the 1982 murder of Perman Gilbert. This mystery is actually a request from a listener named Les, so thank you very much, Les. It was featured on the very first season of Unsolved Mysteries, and I actually consider it to be one of their more underrated segments. This is the story of a seemingly ordinary, hard-working family man who went out to perform his job one day, but was then inexplicably murdered for reasons no one understands. But the fact that his body was found nude suggests there was something really personal about this killing. What's especially intriguing about this mystery is that there are no less than 3 fairly plausible theories for Perman's murder, but no concrete evidence to support any of them. But we'll delve into each of these theories momentarily. Before we get started, just a brief reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast which alternates between our regular full-length episodes and shorter minisodes like this one. We deliver either a new full-length episode or a new minisode every Wednesday. We're currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play Music, so if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it. The Trail Went Cold also has its own PayPal account and a donate button on our website. If there's anyone out there who wants to make a donation, we would greatly appreciate it, and we'll be sure to give you a shout-out on a future episode. So with all that out of the way, let us now examine the unsolved murder of Perman Gilbert. Our story begins in the small town of Hamersville, Ohio in 1982. Our central figure is 46-year-old Perman Gilbert, who lives with his wife Joanne and their 4 children. Perman makes his living as an appliance repairman and has worked for General Electric for over 20 years, but on weekends, he earns extra income by working independently and doing his own service calls. At 8:30 a.m. on the morning of Saturday, May 22nd, Perman climbed into his van and left his home on what promised to be a routine workday. His schedule would involve making service calls to homes in a couple of small towns in the area, Mount Orab, Georgetown, and Aberdeen, the latter of which was about a 40-minute drive away from Hamersville. After that, Perman was scheduled to return home at around 3 p.m., but on this particular day, he never arrived. Joanne Gilbert stayed up late waiting for him, but when it got to be 3 a.m., and her husband still hadn't shown up, she started calling around to see if anyone had seen Perman. Since no one seemed to know where he was, Joanne contacted the police. The following evening at around 6:20 p.m., Perman's nude body was discovered in Claremont County in a ditch next to Swope Road. The location was just outside the town of Bethel, and was about 7 miles away from the Gilbert home. Perman had been beaten and shot twice in the chest, likely with a .38 caliber weapon. Since there were no cloth fibers found in the bullet wounds, this indicated that Perman had at least been nude from the waist up when he was shot, and there were no marks on him to indicate he had been tied up. Since there was no rigidity in his body, the coroner determined that Perman was likely dead no more than 10 hours before he was found, placing his time of death sometime that morning. Perman's van could not be located anywhere in the vicinity, but it would be discovered the following day on the side of a rural road in Adams County, located approximately 22 miles from where Perman's body was found. While Perman's toolbox and supplies were still inside the van, the only personal item of his which could be found was his wristwatch, which was hanging on the gearshift lever. Since Perman was a member of the Freemasons, he always carried a wallet with a Masonic symbol on it, as well as a special Masonic belt buckle, but those items were missing, and the rest of his clothing was never found. While there were unidentified fingerprints and hair samples inside the van, they could never be matched to a specific person. Investigators attempted to retrace Perman's movements on the day he disappeared, and learned that his morning service calls went as planned in Mount Orab, Georgetown, and Aberdeen, before he used the Simon Kenton Bridge to cross the state line and drive into Maysville, Kentucky. Even though Perman did not have a scheduled service call in Maysville, he often frequented the town and knew many of its residents. Shortly after 1 p.m., he visited a local market and purchased some cigarettes. He then went into a flower shop next door and asked the woman working there for a specific female employee who apparently knew exactly what he wanted. Perman was told this employee wasn't scheduled to come in until 4 o'clock, so he said he would return later, and then left. And this would turn out to be the last confirmed sighting of Perman before his body was found the following day. The crime was incredibly baffling to everyone who knew Perman, since he was a very well-liked person in the community and didn't seem to have any enemies. After delving into his background, investigators came up with 3 potential theories. Even though he made his living as an appliance repairman, Perman's number one passion was flying. He was a licensed pilot with his own small plane and a landing strip on his property. Joanne claimed that Perman once told her that he'd been approached about using his plane to transport drugs. Apparently, the proposed scheme would involve Perman flying the drugs to a certain airport and then going off somewhere to get a cup of coffee after he landed. When Perman returned to the plane, the drugs would have been retrieved, and he'd find a payoff of money under his seat. Perman told Joanne that he turned this proposal down on multiple occasions, which his family feared might have led to his murder, but no evidence was ever found to link his death to any drug trafficking. However, even though Perman had a clean criminal record, the same could not be said about his youngest brother, Vernon Gilbert. Throughout his life, Vernon had often found himself in and out of trouble with the law, and it finally got to the point where he wound up becoming a witness in an organized crime case. 3 months before Perman's death, Vernon was called upon to travel from his home in California to testify in front of a federal grand jury in a hearing at the Hamilton County Courthouse in Cincinnati. In spite of Vernon's personal problems, Perman was always very devoted to his brother and accompanied him to the hearing to lend his support. Since the hearing was closed to the public, Perman was not allowed inside the courtroom, so he would have to kill time for a while his brother testified. Perman left the courthouse and spent this time hanging around downtown Cincinnati, but later told his family that he got the distinct impression that he was being followed by a large unidentified man. Anyway, authorities were not allowed to reveal any specific details about this organized crime case with Perman, or his family, though it was believed to be connected to drugs. One possible theory was that Perman was killed by people connected with the case to frighten Vernon out of testifying, or as retribution. It was also suggested that Perman's death was an attempt to lure Vernon out of hiding in order to attend his brother's funeral, but surprisingly, even though they had a close relationship, Vernon did not actually show up to the funeral. The last major theory was that Perman's murder was a crime of passion, an idea which was supported by the fact that his body was found nude. Since Perman's job involved him frequently making service calls to homes while women were there alone, could Perman have gotten involved in a secret affair gone wrong? Could he have been murdered by a jilted lover, or possibly an enraged husband or boyfriend who discovered that Perman was sleeping with his spouse? Well, authorities looked into this angle, but never uncovered any evidence that Perman was involved in any affairs. A $20,000 reward was offered for information, but in spite of all these different potential theories, investigators failed to drum up any strong leads. There are still no solid suspects, or any concrete motive for Perman Gilbert's murder, and the case continues to remain unsolved after 35 years. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. Before we continue, we would like to take a moment to thank our sponsor, HelloFresh.com, for supporting The Trail Went Cold. I always joke that if we ever made a podcast about my cooking skills, we would have to retitle it, The Meal Went Cold. That's why I'm very grateful for the convenience of HelloFresh, who save me a lot of time on shopping and cooking. HelloFresh is the meal kit delivery service that makes cooking more fun, so you can focus on the whole experience, not just the final plate. Each week, HelloFresh creates new delicious recipes with step-by-step instructions. Each recipe is designed to take around 30 minutes to make in your kitchen. The recipes are set up so that anyone can make a delicious and nutritious home-cooked meal in 30 minutes, whether you cook for yourself or are not so comfortable making home-cooked meals. HelloFresh sources the freshest ingredients, measured to the exact quantities needed, so there's no food waste. Everything is delivered to your doorstep in a recyclable, insulated box. HelloFresh is also now offering light spring meals and has introduced breakfast options. It's a value of less than $10 per meal. Since this podcast is now teamed up with HelloFresh, they are now offering everyone in our audience $30 off your first week of deliveries when you go to HelloFresh.com and use the offer code COLD30. That's COLD30. I can't tell you how many great shipments of meals from HelloFresh I've enjoyed these past several months. The other night, in only 30 minutes, I was able to prepare a delicious meal of Bangladeshi chicken curry, complete with cauliflower, zucchini, and mint chutney. At the time, I was spending the evening working on this very episode, so this easy-to-cook dish was incredibly convenient for me. It's also the type of meal you folks would enjoy eating while listening to podcast episodes such as this. So once again, be sure to visit HelloFresh.com and use the code COLD30 to get $30 off your first week of deliveries. That's COLD30. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the show. So like I said, this is a pretty interesting case because it has 3 very distinct theories, but no strong evidence to prove or disprove any of them. However, while digging into old newspaper archives, I found a couple of articles published in the months following the murder containing 2 key pieces of information not mentioned during the Unsolved Mystery segment, which took me by surprise. Number 1. Shortly after Perman's body was found, some police officers apparently heard a broadcast containing a description of his missing van, but it also said that 4 men, possibly armed, might be in it. The chief of detectives on the case was later asked about this, and claimed he did not hear this broadcast, and there's pretty much no follow-up. I have no idea where this info about 4 armed men in Perman's van originally came from, but maybe it was just some sort of miscommunication or error. It's still pretty odd, though. I revealed the second surprising piece of info earlier in the podcast, but it was also not mentioned in Unsolved Mysteries. And that's the coroner's determination that Perman had been dead no more than 10 hours before he was found, meaning his death would have occurred early on Sunday morning, May 23rd. And that's quite an interesting wrinkle, since the last confirmed sighting of Perman took place shortly after 1 p.m. on May 22nd, and he had told his wife to expect him home around 3 o'clock that same afternoon. So if he was killed the following morning, that's around 18 hours in which Perman was alive, and his whereabouts are completely unaccounted for. That kind of makes me look at this case in a bit of a different light, but I'll get back to that in a little while. First, let's break down each of the 3 proposed theories, one by one. For starters, there's the theory that Perman was murdered because he refused to use his plane to perform drug smuggling. Well, the biggest issue here is that all we really have is Joanne Gilbert's word that Perman once told her he had been approached by drug dealers. I mean, I have no reason to believe she's making this up, but as far as I can tell, we don't even know if there was a drug smuggling operation in that area to begin with, let alone one that was connected to Perman. On Unsolved Mysteries, there is a reenactment where the actor portraying Perman is approached at his plane by a pair of drug dealers, and he tells them, "If you guys don't stop bothering me, I'm going to the authorities." I mean, that's just a reenactment, so I have no idea if Perman actually said something like that, but I guess if the people involved in this drug smuggling operation were paranoid that Perman would go to the police, that might have motivated them to murder him. I guess it's also possible that Perman lied to his wife and really was involved with drug smuggling, but got in way over his head and was killed for it. But there's no evidence to support any of this, and if Perman's murder was drug-related, it's weird that his body would be found nude, though Joanne stated that she believed this was done in order to humiliate the family. Now that idea is bolstered somewhat by our second story, which is that Perman's murder is connected to his brother Vernon's testimony in an organized crime case. But it's hard to do too much speculation on that one, since the authorities never released any specific details about that case. There were rumors it might have involved drugs, but I have no idea how that case ultimately turned out, and what happened to Vernon afterward. It is possible that Vernon may have shared incriminating information about this case with Perman, which put his life in danger, and even if he didn't, someone might have gotten the mistaken impression that Perman knew something. Perman believed that someone was following him while he attended his brother's hearing in Cincinnati. That could have been nothing more than paranoia on his part, but I guess it's possible that someone connected to Vernon's case might have been scouting the courthouse while the hearing took place. When they saw Vernon being accompanied there by Perman, they might have become curious about him and decided to check him out. But again, I know nothing about this organized crime case, or how much it relied on Vernon's testimony. If Vernon was such an important witness, you'd think it would have been more efficient to go after him, rather than murder his brother. But I suppose Vernon might have been in witness protection or something, and they just could not get to him. It is pretty weird that Vernon did not even show up for Perman's funeral, so I would love to know more about his background, and what effect his brother's death might have had on him. However, the biggest problem with the idea of Perman's murder being linked to drug trafficking or organized crime is that it doesn't really have the hallmarks of a contract killing. Unidentified fingerprints were found inside his van, and you'd think that a professional criminal would have wiped them clean. These prints have also never been matched to anyone, so whoever committed the murder has not been arrested for any other crime. There's a lot to suggest the perpetrator was someone who had never killed before. Another issue is that we don't know the exact location where Perman was killed. We know that he was last seen in Maysville, but his body was found over 30 miles from there, and only 7 miles away from his home. Perman spent the entire morning driving to 3 different service calls in 3 different towns before he arrived in Maysville at around 1 p.m. Unless someone was following Perman from the moment he left his house that morning, I don't know how a hitman would have found him that day. And if they were following him since he left the house, why not kill him immediately instead of allowing him to make all those service calls? When you look at the circumstances of this murder, the most plausible theory seems to be that it was a crime of passion, namely, that Perman was having an affair and was killed by the angry spouse of the woman he was seeing. I know that Perman's family have always leaned towards the other theories, but I'm sure they'd prefer not to believe that he was screwing around. I don't know what the gossip mill was like in the community, and it might seem surprising that there weren't any juicy rumors to aid in the investigation, but Perman's job did involve making service calls to homes where women would be alone in the house when he visited. Not to make light of the whole situation, but how many porn films have been made based on this exact same scenario? It's not implausible that a secret affair between Perman and one of his customers could have flown under the radar, because it's not going to look overly suspicious if an appliance repairman is seen visiting their home. There's an amusing section during the Unsolved Mystery segment where they interview the female cashier from the market Perman visited in Maysville. She said Perman was a regular customer at the market, and they had this running gag where Perman would flirtatiously ask her if she'd have lunch with him, even though he knew she'd always say no. I know Perman had this image of a loving family man, but if this is how he usually acted around women, then I could see him not being 100% faithful. But if this was the motive behind Perman's murder, how exactly would these events have played out? The one part of this story which I found confusing is Perman's visit to the flower shop, which turned out to be the last time he was seen alive. He apparently wanted to order flowers, and asked for a specific female employee, but when he was told she wouldn't be in until 4 o'clock, he left. The woman who spoke to Perman at the flower shop was interviewed on Unsolved Mysteries, but the segment didn't tell us anything about this other employee, and that's pretty strange. If you search hard enough, you'll find a thread about this case in the Topics forum, in which a poster reveals the name of this employee and claims that she was dating Perman. Of course, you should always take everything you read in the Topics forum with a grain of salt, but I've always been curious about who Perman was planning to buy these flowers for. Was it common for Perman to pick up flowers for his wife during his weekend service calls? Because if not, then that's a major red flag. I guess if there's any truth to the rumor that Perman was involved with the flower shop employee, he could have decided to head to her house once he found out she wasn't working, and that's where things went horribly wrong. One of the biggest knocks against the affair theory is the time issue. Perman promised his wife he'd be home by 3 o'clock. He was seen in Maysville just after 1 o'clock, and it takes at least 45 minutes to drive from there to Hamersville, so that wouldn't have left him much time to meet his mistress. I guess it's possible that Perman wasn't planning to get together with her that day, but if he learned that she wasn't working at the flower shop and would be home alone until 4 o'clock, he figured it was an ideal time to pay her a visit. I also think it's possible that Perman didn't visit anyone's home, but crossed paths with someone while driving, and they decided to have sex in his van. I've always found it pretty odd that even though his clothing was never recovered, Perman's wristwatch was found on the gearshift lever, so it's possible he took it off to have sex, and the killer overlooked it. Regardless, since Perman was found nude, and the evidence showed that Perman wasn't wearing his shirt when he was shot, the most plausible explanation is that a jealous husband or boyfriend caught him in the act of having sex with his spouse and flew into a jealous rage, prompting him to beat Perman before shooting him twice. Even if the crime was committed in Maysville, the killer might have decided to lead the investigation away from there by disposing of Perman's body in Claremont County. He then abandoned Perman's van over 20 miles away in order to cause more confusion. It's unlikely the killer could have done this alone, especially since he abandoned the van in the middle of nowhere and would have needed a ride. So he probably forced his spouse to help him cover up the crime and frightened her into staying silent all these years. However, the affair theory is not 100% perfect. Like I said earlier, the one thing which threw me for a loop is the coroner's determination that Perman likely died sometime during the morning of May 23rd, because if Perman was caught having sex and murdered, I always figured this would have taken place sometime during the afternoon of May 22nd, since he told his wife he'd be home around 3 o'clock. Unless Joanne is lying about a whole bunch of things, I don't know if Perman would spend an entire evening with his mistress without even calling home. There are other possibilities. Maybe Perman's killer caught him in the act and severely beat him, but wasn't sure what to do next, so he held him captive overnight, before ultimately deciding to shoot him the following morning. Or I guess it's possible that Perman was shot and had his body dumped in the ditch sometime on the 22nd, but was still alive at the time, and he did not actually die until morning, which is a pretty horrific thought. If I had to go with an alternate theory besides the affair, it's that Perman could have been kidnapped by organized crime figures linked to Vernon's case, who held him captive for an entire night, beating and torturing Perman to find out how much his brother told him. Regardless of what Perman knew, they subsequently murdered him the following morning and disposed of his body. If that weird police broadcast about looking for 4 armed men in Perman's van is true, then that would support the organized crime theory. But then again, there were no marks on Perman to indicate he was tied up, so how would he have been held captive? It's a pretty baffling case. Overall, I'd lean towards the affair theory, but I'm not 100%. I would not be surprised if the truth is entirely different. So if you have any information about the unsolved murder of Perman Gilbert, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own theory about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email at robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. So a big thanks to the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. Another big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. And we also have a new donor this week named Kenneth, so thank you very much, Kenneth. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play Music. We also have a private Facebook discussion group for The Trail Went Cold, so if you want to discuss this podcast or its featured cases with myself or your fellow listeners, feel free to join at any time, and I'll approve your entry into the group ASAP. And like I mentioned earlier, we also have a donate button on our website, so if you want to express your appreciation for all the hard work we put in this podcast, we'd be extremely grateful. So have yourself a good week, and join me next Wednesday for a brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.